Psalms 118, verses 1 through 9. Give thanks to the Lord, for he is good. His love endures forever. Let Israel say, his love endures forever. Let the house of Aaron say, his love endures forever. Let those who fear the Lord say, his love endures forever. When hard pressed, I cried to the Lord. He brought me into a spacious place. The Lord is with me. I will not be afraid. What can mere mortals do to me? The Lord is with me. He is my helper. I look in triumph on my enemies. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in humans. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes. The word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Amen. Hey, you may be seated, everyone. Hey, welcome to Hope Church. My name is Drew. I'm one of the pastors here. And last week, we actually kicked off this new message series called Counterformed. Can I hear you say counterformed? That's right. And what we've been talking about is how there are so many ways in which the world around us, whatever religious disposition you come from, or even if it's not a religious disposition, all of us have been formed by various voices, images, stories that exist in the world today, whether it's the media around us, whether it's social media, whether it's LinkedIn, whether it's all these different kinds of ways in which we have been shaped. But what does it look like for us to actually be counterformed? To be formed instead of all these other voices and media and social media forming us, what does it look like for us to actually be formed by the living God, by Jesus? Now, for those of you who are not a Christians or who aren't a Christian here, I just want to say welcome. So glad you're here. You actually get to hear and listen to what do Christians actually believe about what should shape us and form us, and what should be the things that we value as Christians. And so many of you may or may not know, but I actually just got back from an 11-week sabbatical. And now I recognize that an 11-week sabbatical, some of you all, you hear that and you gasp a little because you're like, I want an 11-week sabbatical. So I recognize it was a great, immense privilege for us to be able to go on sabbatical. I want to thank our staff and our elder team for that privilege. Many of you, perhaps you know or you don't know that statistics for burnout, especially amongst vocational clergy, is as high as it's ever been. Many pastors, and in fact, many people, whenever I told them that we were going on sabbatical, most people were just kind of like, what's wrong with you and Tina? Like, are you guys okay? Or are you guys going anywhere? And I just want you to know, we actually have this rhythm of going on sabbaticals to live into this counterformational principle of creating margin or spaciousness in our own lives. So with that said, as we're back, listen, I love New York City. I love this church. We plan on being here for a long while, unless we get a call from Hawaii or something. But nonetheless, we love this city, and there's no place we'd rather be than right here at Hope Church, right here in New York City. And so the reason why we put this formational practice of going on sabbaticals regularly, not only for myself, but for the rest of our staff in place, is because I know that I am a workaholic. And everything in me, the story that's been told to me, the way that I've been shaped for most of my life has really been about, hey, Drew, you are what you produce. You are what you've done. You are what you achieve. Why haven't you done this yet? Why aren't you better at this? Why aren't you better than this person at that thing that they're doing that's similar to what you're doing, but they're doing it better? Like, all those voices have been steeped within my psyche. I grew up in an immigrant background, and my dad, for instance, he actually switched careers, went into vocational ministry at the age of 40. He's now 78 years old, and he's told me, he's like, listen, in 38 years, I've written 40 books. You've only written one. Like, what's your problem? You're never gonna catch me. And so you gotta understand, there's a part of me that I'm like, yeah, I gotta catch up. I'm not doing enough. And meanwhile, my mom, she worked the graveyard shift just to take care of us. And growing up in an immigrant background, being constantly told that I wasn't good enough, that I didn't measure up. And so as a result, there's this thing in me, this chip on my shoulder that I better prove to all these people that I do belong, that I can make it. And even as a pastor in vocational ministry, some of you are like, wow, you've got issues and you're the pastor? Listen, I've got tons of issues. And even as a pastor, these same ambitions, they are so in me. to define myself by what I can do, by what I produce, by how large our church is, by how well we're doing, how much our church is growing, and so on and so forth. And there's this temptation then to be defined by all these other things. Now, there's a part of me, listen, I love being in New York because this is what New York is about. In fact, this is what most of us move to the city for, or the reason why we stay is because New York is a city that hustles. We're a city of winners. We're a city that continues to do better, and that's why we root for the New York Yankees. I didn't mention the Mets, but nonetheless. But I mean, isn't that what our city is defined by? And that's one of the reasons why I love it here. I love the hustle. I love achieving. And if I were to kind of wrap up all the ambitions in this very room, many of us carry those same longings and ambitions, and that's why we live in this city, which is why it is so counterformational to actually take times of spaciousness, of pausing, of resting, of not achieving, and being okay with that. And for me, one of the hardest parts about going on sabbatical is the first 2 weeks to a month, because there's a part of me that is like, oh, I gotta let go, like turn off all the Slack notifications and all the emails and everything else and basically be like, okay, I'm gonna completely step away. But of course, right when I step away, I'm like, but I didn't tell Dave about this and this that needs to happen, and these changes perhaps that need to happen in the budget, and this staff person, you need to have this conversation, and like all those voices of things that I need to produce. And so it's actually quite healthy for me to get away, to actually create spaciousness or margin in my life. Not only for renewal, but also for my own spiritual formation, and to give space to actually bring attention to areas of my life that need working on. And so entering into this sabbatical with my wife, Tina, and our family, one of the issues that we realized for myself that I really need to continue to grow in is, number one, is my impatience. I tend to be a very impatient person. Now, I recognize most of you as New Yorkers, you're like, what's wrong with that? Like, what's wrong with impatience? But in addition to impatience, there's also just this defensiveness that would emerge at various moments, I recognized. First with Tina, my wife, in different conversations that we would have, there'd be this defensiveness whenever I would feel a certain amount of criticism, and I'll unpack some of that in the weeks to come. Or there was defensiveness when it came to our executive team and some of the staff that I would meet with, or our elder board. If there was any kind of criticism or perceived or real or unreal, I would erupt with some defensiveness. So there was specific attention that I was giving to those areas during the sabbatical. So you could imagine that the first week after we had finished here, we're on sabbatical, and I took my son as well as a few of his friends. They were going to play basketball at a nearby park in Murray Hill. And so they're going to play 3-on-3 basketball. And so as they're playing 3-on-3 basketball, I'm just sitting down, just kind of reflecting and praying. I'm like, God, please work on these unformed areas of my heart and my life. So as my son's playing basketball with his friends, I see this young man who's also there. And this young man, there's a bunch of people playing basketball at the various courts and stuff, but this one young guy, and I could tell he's pretty skilled, almost like he's probably played before, competitive basketball before, because of, just the skills that you can observe in this young guy. And he's kind of weaving in and out with people, like doing crossover dribbles and behind the back and between the legs. And he starts like playing basketball and weaving in and out of where my son and his friends are playing. And there's a part of me that's getting really annoyed. I'm like, dude, what are you doing? This is their court right now. And he, even when my son and they would be playing like out on the perimeter in the basketball court, he would go and even shoot layups on the court that he's playing on. They're playing on like half court. So I start getting super annoyed, and my blood starts to boil a little bit. And I'm like, okay, if he stays here, I'm gonna say something to this guy. Like, what's his problem? Like, these kids, they're on the court. They need to be able to play. So as I'm getting ready, I'm just kind of like fuming inside. This guy, I notice, like, he dribbles and he looks at me, and then he starts coming towards me. And as he's coming towards me, he goes, hey, Pastor Drew? Hey, man. Oh, dude, I attended Hope a couple weeks ago, and oh, man, I loved your sermon. And immediately I was just like, oh, hey. Nice to meet you, man. What's your name? Man, you look pretty good. You look like you're a pretty good basketball player. Oh, dude, that's so cool how you're weaving in and out, and you've got a really solid handle there. And he's like talking to me. I'm like, oh, yeah. And then, he says goodbye, and I was like, oh, my goodness. I could sense. I just kind of was like, oh, my goodness. I have so much to work on. Like here I was fuming at this guy. If you're here today, I'm sorry. Listen, I don't know where you might be, one of our locations, but. And I just realized like this summer would be a time, yes, it would be replenishing for me, but there's a lot of formational work that God needs to do in me. And a lot of that can only come when there's enough spaciousness in my own life and journey, when there's enough margin for me to reflect. And in many ways, the margin that perhaps you've created just to show up here, perhaps this is your spaciousness and part of your rhythms to create a time where you can ask God and invite God and say, God, what are you trying to say to me? What are you trying to speak to me? What are the areas, the hidden areas of my life that perhaps I have not paid attention to? You know, one of the passages that I looked to time and time again during the sabbatical was this passage from Psalm 118, verse 5. And I immediately would be drawn to this verse. Look at what it says. It says, when hard pressed, I cried to the Lord. He brought me into a spacious place. Now, this image, it's a psalm of praise. In fact, time and time again in the first few verses, they would sing of how God's love endures forever. And then all of a sudden, this passage comes into play. Now, here's what it translates to in English, literally. Look at what this passage says. It says, from the narrow place, the Hebrew word is mitzar, from the narrow place. A narrow place is kind of like a constricted space. Like you're tight, you're constricted. Have you ever been in a claustrophobic space where you're just kind of like cramped? During Labor Day weekend on Saturday, our family, we went out to lunch. And so on the way back, though, it started pouring rain. It kind of came out of nowhere. We did not expect it. So, of course, we run into the subway, trying to get onto the subway so that we can go home instead of walking home, which we customarily would have done. And so, of course, as we're down there, though, some of the trains are not stopping at that stop. And it's super crowded, and it's very muggy, and it's very humid, and there's people everywhere. Anyone been there before? You know what I'm talking about? It's this meitzar. It's like this, get me out of here. Like, what am I doing here? Like, why are all these people here right now? And in that place, I called Yahweh. Yahweh answered me in the spacious, or merchav, in this spacious place. It's this verse that really is talking about like, oh my goodness, like you're cramped, you're crowded, it's like constricted. And then finally, right, that moment when we finally get on the train and we come out the doors and you're like, I could breathe in that fresh Manhattan Midtown air. Have you ever had that experience? And it's almost this image, like you've been taken from this cramped, constricted space, this narrow space, but you've been liberated into a free, spacious place. And see, the image of the psalmist is basically that when I cry out to God and when I'm in this place, when I feel like I'm shackled, there's a God who actually hears our cry and he leads us into broad and spacious places. And reflecting on this image of what does it look like? God wants to bring us into these spacious places, into freedom. But the reality is most of us, when it comes to the ways that we live our lives, especially in this city, and the values and the ways that we've been shaped and formed, the voices that tell us you are only how much money you make, or what school you went to, or how profitable you are. There's all these voices that continue to cripple us and honestly constrict us. And the message of freedom that God wants to bring us to these wide open spaces, to bring us to a place of freedom so that we can experience the fullness that God might have for us. That when we cry out to the Lord, yes, this is what God does. He actually liberates us. He liberates us from all of those different kinds of voices that needle us, tell us we're not good enough, tell us that, oh my goodness, look how much better that person is than you. All these comparison words, all of the ways that we have been formed by the world. Now, again, don't get me wrong. I love the ambition of this city. But what does it look like for us to be counterformed in a city to live out our ambition? But our initial impulse is not to be shaped by these narrow spaces, but to be shaped by the one who wants to lead us into a spacious place. Now, one of the images and the motifs that exist throughout the scriptures is this theme throughout the Old Testament scriptures as well as in the New Testament, is this idea of a desert or wilderness. So for instance, in the history of the people of Israel, they're liberated from Egypt, and after they're liberated from Egypt, they're actually drawn into this spacious place called the desert or the wilderness. Now, the desert or the wilderness is this spacious place. They're free from the bondage of slavery. But the wilderness would be a time where it's not like it's this easy place, but it's a place where God speaks and shapes the people of Israel in a very specific way. So for instance, after Israel is freed from 400 years of bondage by Egypt, they're given what's called the 10 Commandments. And in the 10 Commandments, right there, and even if you're not familiar with the 10 Commandments, some of you, if I were to say, what do you think might be on the 10 Commandments? Most of us would be like, okay, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not bear false witness against your neighbor. A lot of these, some of us, it might even be intuitive to us. Now, here's what's amazing is that God, in one of the commandments, in one of the 10, as these people are being liberated from slavery in the will and going into the desert and the wilderness, God is trying to shape and form the people of Israel into a new identity, a new people who are shaped by different values, who are formed by his voice. Now, one of the commandments is, listen, remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. In other words, keep a 24-hour period in which you're going to stop working, you're going to rest, you're going to delight, and you're going to contemplate. Now, some of us are like, wait, that's right up there with thou shalt not murder? What in the world are you talking about? And yes, it's given as a commandment, because do you see what God is doing? God is basically saying, hey, listen, you've been shaped by 400 years of someone telling you, you are what you do. You are your job. You are what you produce, how much money you make. You are how successful you are. And you know, God's basically like, no. I want you to know, I command you to stop and rest because you are free. Because as free people, you get to do nothing and I still love you. See, now that's fundamentally the message of the good news of the gospel. That Jesus, out of his grace for us, has mercy and forgiveness for us. And that our identity is shaped by being able to live spacious lives, that we don't have to be defined by our work or what we produce. Now, the desert and the wilderness would be a place that would continue to shape God's people. So for instance, there are different Old Testament prophets who would go to the wilderness to hear from God. In other words, the desert and the wilderness was the place. It wasn't the easiest place all the time, but it was that spacious place in which I can hear more closely to God. Now, Isaiah would talk about the wilderness as well and how that shapes us, for instance. John the Baptist in the New Testament had such a prophetic word about following God instead of repenting of the ways of the world and following God. And he himself lived in the desert. He was a voice in the wilderness. Jesus himself goes into the wilderness to fast and to pray. So you see this motif then, that people would actually go to the desert, to this spacious place. Why? So that they could hear from God, so they could listen to God's voice, and so they could pray. Now, here's a little bit of church history for you. Here's what's crazy, is that Jesus dies and he resurrects from the grave. After he resurrects from the grave, the church is born. But the church is born, and honestly, it's this small minority oppressed group. And Rome, of course, with its mighty army, with the gladiators and the Colosseum, Rome is basically like, who are these Christians? Pfft, nothing. So there's persecution that comes to these Christians for 3 centuries. So could you imagine, for hundreds of years, there's persecution after persecution, bloodshed after bloodshed of Christians. Now, here's what would happen in the early church. Even despite its bloodshed, the church grew. But you can imagine what happens when some Christians, especially some Christian leaders, so clergy, for instance, like myself, people who were called to lead the church, they were given this opportunity to actually, Rome would say to some of these Christian leaders, hey, I want you to say Caesar is Lord or die and perish. Now, of course, if I were in their shoes, I would love to be able to say, I would be brave. And I would say, yes, Jesus is Lord. Caesar is not Lord. But you can imagine what happened. A lot of these Christian leaders, some of them they perished for their faith. But some Christian leaders, they were basically like, oh, you mean I'm going to die for this? Caesar is Lord. I'll go with Caesar here. Now, that group of Christians and Christian leaders, they were called lapsed. Now, why were they lapsed? It was because when the going got tough, they were just like, hey, you know what? This faith thing, it's really great. This Jesus person, amazing, but peace out. I'm going to live. And they were called lapsed. Now, here's what happens, though. like persecution after persecution happens. Then the Emperor Constantine in 312 is about to go to battle, but he actually, 312 AD, he has this vision. And in this vision, he has an image of a cross on a shield. And he believes that that cross and that shield is an invitation for him to put his trust in Jesus, to believe that Jesus is going to deliver him in this battle. Constantine ends up winning the battle. And what ends up happening to Constantine is now, all of a sudden, he basically says, you are now free to worship Jesus. In 380 AD, it actually becomes affirmed throughout the Roman Empire. In fact, not only is it free to worship Jesus, the Roman Empire will now be a Christian empire. Oh, snap. Could you imagine what happened? Like all these people that had lapsed. Like, so now all of a sudden, if you're a Christian leader, now you're in bed with power and money and privilege. Because all these people that were being persecuted for their faith, all of a sudden they're like, actually, you guys are now the cool kids. Come and leave the Mets and join the Yankees. No, I'm just kidding. Right? Like come and now you're in a position of power and privilege. Now, there's a problem though. Wait a minute. There's a problem. All these Christians now are in power. They're like, oh my goodness, now we're in positions of power in Rome. We've got political clout. We've got armies behind us. But what about these lapsed Christians? They're basically like, actually, Caesar's Lord. You know what? Jesus is Lord. I was just kidding. Jesus is Lord. I really would have said that to begin with. It's just, there are all sorts of pressure. But now, so could you imagine the early church? They're just like, hey, no, you can't do that. You can't just say, like, all of a sudden, now that you're the cool kids, like, now you guys, now you want to have all this power and these titles and this wealth? And this was a significant controversy in the church. Now, around that time, birthed one of the most significant movements when it comes to Christian spirituality. It was this movement called the desert spirituality, desert fathers and mothers. People would see what was going on and see the excesses of the church and all the ways they were drawn by the same voices and values of the world, of money and power. And they basically said, you know what, that's not the way of Jesus. So what did they do? They fled to the desert. And thus, in the 3rd and 4th century, it birthed this movement called desert spirituality, a people who would renounce the ways of the world so that they could follow Jesus more closely. Now, through the centuries, as the church grew in power and stature, people would actually flee to the desert, and they would actually start what's called monasteries. And these monasteries were these places where people would renounce the ways of the world, and they would say, no, we want to live so that our life is prayer with God. To not get shaped and formed by all these worldly voices, but to be shaped and formed by Jesus. So they would leave, and these monasteries were formed in these different places, and these communities started to be birthed about saying, this is how we want to follow Jesus. That's so different than the ways of the world. Now, there's actually a monastery, a community that exists in central Greece, and it's called Meteora. And has anyone been to Meteora before? Yeah, Jesse and Nico. It's a beautiful place. Now, Meteora, the Greek word, actually literally means suspended in the air. Now, why is it called suspended in the air? You see, in the town of Kalabaka, if you were to look, there's actually this first image, and here's an image of what you would find if you were to actually go into this city in Kalabaka. You see these rock formations, and in these rock formations, you'll notice all these small little caves. Now, these caves, starting in around the 9th century, there were people that wanted to flee, again, from the excesses of the world and the values of the world. So what they did was they would take, in an effort to get closer to God, they would go closer to God in the air, climb up and live in these caves. And in these caves, they would live lives in solitary prayer. Now, there's all these stories that have been passed down about what they ate, how they went to the bathroom, and how they drank water. It's really a stunning kind of story of how they would seek solace so that their hearts could be pure from the world and be closer to God, suspended in the air. Now, in the 14th and 16th centuries, different communities would actually form in this area. Up to 24 different monasteries formed in these cliffs. Now, today, there are still some monks and nuns that live up in some of these monasteries, but it's really a beautiful, stunning kind of tourist attraction as well. And here's a picture of, again, one of those monasteries that exists on top of one of these rock formations. Now, this place, Meteora, as well as the monasteries, it was emblematic of the kind of devotion people had to say, I want to renounce the ways of the world, all the voices that have shaped me in the world when it comes to money, power, sex, whatever it might be. I want to live wholeheartedly for Jesus. See, they would live so much so that they would go suspended in the air in these rock formations, as well as these monastic communities that would exist on top of these rock formations. Now, some of you might be wondering, you're like, wait a minute, so are you asking us to move to Greece in Meteora? No, I'm not. Because let me show you the block that I live on. It's also suspended in the air. There's, right there in Murray Hill there, and kind of crowded because of Chick-fil-A as well. And, you know, in the zip code that I live in Murray Hill, it's half a square mile there's 55,000 people that live in the zip code. Sometimes I wish I was in solitary cave outside, but here I am in the middle of the city, desperate for Jesus, but what do I do with this? Now, throughout the history of the church, there were actually people that were called to what's called the mixed life. The mixed life is a life where, yes, just like these monks, my heart is Jesus. That more than the voices that exist out there in the world around me, my heart is Jesus. My heart is to live a life of prayer that's informed by Jesus. But at the same token, I exist in the world as a missional person, to be sent by God into the world, to live in whatever vocation I live in, whether that's in medicine or law or finance or the arts or in education or in social services, whatever it might be. And the invitation for each one of us, yes, some of you who maybe you are called to move to Meteora, but most of us, here we are living in the city, and the invitation is a mixed life. Is how can my life be about Jesus first? How can I live with a spaciousness where I meet with Jesus first? Now, here's a picture of the way that I'm trying to live out spaciousness. This is the room and the chair in which every morning and midday when I'm at home and in the evening, I sit down in this chair, I turn my timer on, I have a time of silence and contemplation. And I read and I pray. I pray for my defensiveness. I pray for my family. I pray for you all. I'm not going to lie. I fall asleep in that chair a lot. It's very comfortable. Very comfortable. I'd highly recommend a comfortable chair. But in many ways, it's a subversive call to live into this heart of prayer. Now, some of you might be wondering, you're like, wait a minute, doesn't Jesus talk about narrow paths and wide paths as well? And yes, he does. Check this out. Look at what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 7. He says, enter through the narrow gate, for wide is the gate and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it, but small is the gate and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it. Now, what's Jesus talking about? See, he's talking about the invitation that goes to everyone, but only a few people are really willing to live into it. Because most are like, I'll follow Caesar. I'll follow my career. I'll follow the money. I'll follow all these other things. And yet Jesus' invitation is like, don't you see, it's a narrow road to follow Jesus. Now, how does that relate, though, to this idea? To this idea that, you know what, I cried out when I was in this constricted, narrow space, but you led me into a spacious. How did that fall? How does that come together? See, don't you see, in New York, spaciousness is part of the narrow path. Spaciousness, being freed and liberated from all those other voices. That the reality is most of us and most of our coworkers and most of our neighbors and most of the people who live in the city are living according to different ways and different standards and different values. But what does it look like for us to say no over and against the ambition? And there's nothing wrong with ambition. I hope you're ambitious in many different ways. But over and against that, I follow Jesus. I want to live according to his voice, his ways, his kindness. And instead of the patterns of violence that exist in the world, I want to be a person of love and forgiveness and kindness. Do you want to be free to live that way? Because that, my friends, is the narrow path of spaciousness. Now, some of you might be wondering, though, you're like, wait a minute, is spaciousness the goal? Is that what you're saying? That I just need to rest at different times and take time to sit in a chair and fall asleep? And is that the goal? No. See, the goal has never simply been spaciousness. The goal is Jesus. Look at what it says. Psalm 46:10, be still. Why should I be still? Why should I practice silence and solitude and prayer, a life of prayer? So that you can know that God is God. Notice at the end of Psalm 118, this very passage that talks about being led into a spacious place. It says, it is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in princes. It is better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in humans. See, the goal of all of this is Jesus. Will you make space for Jesus? Will you say, Jesus, you are my aim. You are my everything. You know, some of us, we might say, oh, I don't have time for that. Well, the reality is we make time for the things that are important to us. Well, you don't know my job, Drew, or you don't know. Listen, there was this one moment when I was leading a Bible study on a Tuesday night, and this Bible study, listen, that's part of my job. And a friend of mine, he messaged me, and he's like, hey, listen, I've got tickets on Tuesday night to see the New York Knicks, 4th row, play LeBron and the Lakers. Are you in? Are you available? And I wrote in 0.5 seconds, I wrote, absolutely, I'm available. And then I told the group that I was supposed to lead the Bible study. I said, hey, it's an emergency, guys. I just, something came up. Something came up. I mean, isn't it true? We make time for whatever's important to us. And the question is, will you, while we're trying to follow Jesus in the city, will we make time for the things that matter? To be formed by the voice of the one whose love and commitment is true. You know, I shared this story at our worship night, how here I was praying for patience and non-defensiveness. And, you know, I was coming back from sabbatical, I was fired up. I was ready. I'm like, as I'm ready to come back, I'm like trying to think through, like, how am I not going to overwhelm our staff and our congregation with how much energy I have? I was so fired up. And as I'm fired up, I just, you know, my first week back, I just populated my calendar with all sorts of meetings and all this stuff. And so here I was in my first week of meetings. And by the time Friday came around and Friday afternoon before Sabbath for us, like I was pretty tired and had a lot of conversations. And right before Sabbath, Pete Scazzaro, who's my mentor, founder of Emotional Healthy Discipleship, I'm stepping in as the president of that organization. Like Pete calls me up on Friday afternoon. And that week we had been in a lot of meetings and we had a lot of weighty conversations throughout the week. And so by this time, and he was about to go away for a month for spaciousness. So as he's about to go away, he's got all this stuff that he wants to tell me on Friday. And as he's sharing all these things, I just get so annoyed. I'm like, dude, listen, you're the one that's going away for a month. And like, as he's talking, finally, I'm like, Pete, I'm really annoyed right now. And I basically just start telling him, like, listen, I'm really annoyed. I've got everything, just like, I can't believe you're calling me right now and we're talking about this right now. So I'm reactive to him. Like every pattern that I'd been praying for, like all of a sudden my defensiveness, my impatience is all coming out on this Friday, the first week after my sabbatical. So here I was spewing all this stuff. Finally, we get off the phone. And I was like, I need another sabbatical. It didn't work. But I remember kind of immediately after I got off the phone, I was thinking that for most of my life, whenever I would make mistakes or I'd fall into the same patterns, I would just be so harsh towards myself. I'd be like, Drew, can't believe it. You're a pastor. You're just so impatient. Oh my goodness, you were defensive with Pete. You're supposed to be the president of emotionally healthy discipleship, and you're also defensive? And so you could imagine, there's all these negative words. Who do you think you are? You just can't believe, all these negative words. But instead of berating myself, I sat in my chair, took a moment of silence, and I realized that the voices had changed. It was a voice of someone who said, "Oh, Drew, you're still making those same mistakes. Ha ha ha. I still love you. I still died for you. I still have so much grace for you." I texted Pete an apology, and I just kind of chuckled at myself. Still struggling with the same things. But hopefully, better able to hear the voice of the one who died for me and loved me. And what if that God wants to speak to you today too? What if there's areas of your own life and heart? The God of the universe, he wants to tell you of his love. He wants to guide you to his voice.